Hello, I'm Dr. Christina Seisel. I'm happy to have you with me in my class this summer. And today, for our first lesson, we're going to talk about what is research. People often think of research methods as being kind of a dry and dull class, and it certainly can be. Methods are really concerned with the steps we take to do things. But ultimately, what methods allow us to do are to find answers to questions we might have. And so, one of the strengths of taking a methodology course, such as one we're taking this summer together, is the ability to really lay out the thought process that goes into coming to both the answers and opinions we think we have, as well as how to investigate and discover new information. And this is useful, obviously, in business for something like marketing research, or if you were to design an advertising campaign, but it's also quite helpful in everyday life, and especially given how many times studies are referred to in the news and popular press, as well as how much advertising and media we see, understanding the research that goes into making claims, what claims are justifiable and what claims are dubious, and how to tell the difference between that is a very important step. And so I want us to just take a moment while we start to think about what we know and how we know it. Hello, and so what some of you probably came up with are statements a lot like these from some students I had last semester. When asked how we know what we know, a lot of people responded that knowledge came from every day, from family, from the media, or from asking and speaking with friends. And so here we have someone talking about, I believe I've learned from my school or daily surroundings. I pick up on things coming from my family, friends, media, or past experiences. I know what I think I know due to my observations and experiences. I could have been taught the information formally or have concluded what I believe to be the facts from viewing them firsthand. People also appeal to their own personal experience. So I've got 15 plus years of work experience, and I've been able to use that throughout school to give me a different perspective. I know a lot of things through the influence and instruction of my parents. And then another resource is the internet. And so, of course, we have sort of the general black box of humanity available to us with the internet. And there's some good and some bad that comes along with that. But one of the things we're going to talk about when we discuss secondary research is how to use the internet responsibly and how to ascertain the credibility of a source. And so that will be coming up in another lesson soon. But we also learn things from people we've met or reading signs. And so some of the things that this kind of brings to mind is that most of the way we know things or learn isn't systematic. It's not particularly thoughtful. It comes in from the environment around us, and we're able to kind of correlate those ideas together to create knowledge. But what the Berger chapter talks about is that we also, have an interpretation. And one of the things about the research process is to do this more systematically and to think about how we can create knowledge that is verifiable in many ways, or at least, rigorously discovered. And so scholarly research, as opposed to everyday research, is really defined by a particular idea about how the process has been gone about. And depending on what methodology you use, the process looks different and its expectations and criteria for excellence are different. But a lot of things that hold true is that you've gone through it thoroughly. You had your question in mind before you began to come to a conclusion. And so that you entered the research process with an open mind. And so one of the things that, we often do in everyday life is kind of have a conclusion or something we want to hear, and we'll sort of do as much research as necessary to confirm our conclusion or what we want to hear. So Berger talks about the idea of concepts, and he really discusses that they're relational. And so we think about things in terms of what other things are not. And so and this is how humans make sense of the world. It's how language works. And if anyone's familiar with semiotics, this is exactly what semiotics deals with. And so you've got this sort of, the only way we can really know something is by what defined in the negative. And so Glassware is a very large category, but now we know it's not ceramics. But then wine glass is very different than beer stein, and we would picture two different objects if that was what we were looking at. Um, and so, right, a tree is not a bush. We know that. We don't exactly know how or why. We might not know the biological reasoning for that, as a botanist might. But right, conceptually, we've differentiated those. And so we make meaning through binaries. And so that's one of the reasons why he kind of wants to talk about that level of conceptual thinking. And so it's the analysis often reveals social assumptions and fallacies of common sense. So an example of when research might contradict tradition and personal experience was a recent study that was published across several different papers, but looking at the history of children's clothing. And so we were to look at this picture, we'd be pretty much all uniformly agreed upon the normative, expected response would be that the pink is for the girl and that the blue is for the boy. And yet, back in the early 1900s, the opposite was true. And this historian went through documents. She was looking at a history of children's clothing advertising and merchandising, and found conflicting evidence or conflicting opinions. But by the 1900s, it was clear that pink was being used for boys, while blue was being used for girls. And there was much more fluidity. And one of the things with this argument, when we talk about context being important, is that in the context of the 1900s, we're just now emerging with industrial consumer culture. And so up until now, the goal for children's clothing wasn't really to even be cute so much as to be durable and long lasting. And so you wouldn't have wanted to put a particular gender assignment with an outfit, because then the younger child, whose gender and sex you didn't know yet, would not be able to wear it. And so, but also our norms and what we expect babies to look like or how we expect them to be dressed have changed over time. And so it was much more androgynous for children back then. And so here, this is baby Bobby, the paper doll, and his pink dress is in his wardrobe, and his hair is kept in like long ringlets. And I'm not sure if anyone's ever seen this picture before. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a young child. And so children, as the researcher Pelotti, who conducted the study, said, children wore dainty white dresses up until age 6, whether they were male or female. And that it was practicality. You could bleach stains out of white clothing, and you couldn't do that with color. And so as industrialization took over and mass production began, and with the onslaught of advertising, right, those distinctions became more important, particularly as a way of selling products. But that's some of the evidence. That's an example of what historical work can do, and the need to kind of like question beliefs. And so it's not some inalienable association that we have with colors and meanings, but it's something that changes and is sort of socially constructed. It is socially agreed upon at this point in time that these things mean this, that, the other. And so, right, understanding this phenomena, your rationales are going to reflect theoretical approaches. And we're going to talk a bit more about different theoretical approaches to understanding the world in the next lecture. But some of the rationales here are ways to, what does a historical approach tell us about this phenomenon? What would a social approach, economic, cultural, or psychological? And the reasons kind of that are given really kind of bring all of those together, right? We're looking at the historical context of the time, but then there's also an economic motive that occurs to produce more children's clothing for purchase. And so, as well as social pressures and changing socializations with industrialization and mass production, as I had mentioned. And so these things are all combined. They're not independent silos. And so one of the things here is how important interpretation is. And we'll come back to this throughout the class. Data is data. Numbers are just numbers. Data is information not put into context. And so what research really does is it collects the information and then it provides a context for it. It looks at it, examines it from all angles. And so Berger goes to Nietzsche and talks about how we cannot know facts, but only perspectives. The world can be known and interpreted in many different ways. And so context is crucial to understanding, and knowledge itself is contextual and contingent. And so we need to kind of remember that we're always learning more. I mean, individually, hopefully, but also as a society. Research builds upon past research, and that's why secondary research is so very important. And so one of the things that interpretation does is help us be very cognizant of how we're approaching the information we're trying to gather and convey. And so another kind of sticky widget is certainty, right? And so Berger really wants to kind of question whether we can ever be certain or not. And his claim is that if we cannot be certain, often we would ask, what is the point? One of the things to remember here is even as we take down or begin to kind of be critical of some of the things that, a quick and easy definition of research would give us, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. This doesn't open this up to absolute nihilism in interpretation, or I'll just interpret what I want, because there actually is evidence that you need. You need evidence to make a compelling argument. And so when you have your perspective, that's great. Hopefully it's been thought out and built upon through your readings and your work, but also evidence is necessary to make an argument. And without research, you don't have evidence. And so to create a sound argument, you need good quality research, and you need to use it well and interpret it within its with its limitations and with all its flaws. And so one of the frustrating things about research is it can always be improved upon, and it's always very limited. We're limited by time, by ability, by money and equipment access and things like that, and the sort of research we can do. And that's across the board at any given research lab or company, right? There's going to be limitations of some kind or another. And so evidence, and it's always then, that's why it's contextual and contingent. It's contingent upon particular assumptions that we make, and we can make with certainty, with varying levels of certainty about behavior. How universalizing can we make our statement? If I ask 5 people something, even if all 5 people agree, I can't really claim that that's how all of the United States feels, because that just isn't the case. Those are 5 people. There's a lot contaminating that sample. Maybe I know them all. That would be kind of biased. Maybe if they're all in the same geographical space at the time, different areas of the country, hold different opinions or like different things. So of course I'm going to find 5 Cubs fans if I'm interviewing people in Wrigleyville, in Chicago. But right, so that's quality research. That's knowing the limitations and having a good study design. And so that's how you create a sound argument. And that leads to scholarly knowledge. And so scholarly knowledge, as opposed to everyday knowledge, is justified through logic and reason. It's created through analysis. It links information to concepts to create knowledge. And so that's what the bulk of this class is this last sentence on the slide right here. We're linking information or data to concepts such as theories and standards to create knowledge. And we need all 2 pieces of that first part to get to the third. And so to think about concepts a bit, Berger talks about them as to say that everyday ways of knowing can lead to valid knowledge, but we have to question what we assume to be true. And so we can use personal experience, intuition, authority, tradition, and so on as good starting points, but we need to conduct research to lead to valid knowledge about the world. And so one of the examples of this, just things that kind of become counterintuitive, Brings us to the term epistemology, which is basically a term that is the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know, and how do we justify our beliefs? What are the criteria that we're going to use for that? And so some of the questions that this brings up are: what are the sources of knowledge? What are the limits of knowledge? What are the necessary conditions for knowledge? And what constitutes justification of a belief? And so we're looking at questions about the creation and dissemination of knowledge. And this is, when conducting research, what we are always implicitly doing. So different types of knowledge: we can know how to do something, we can know about a topic, we can know why something happened, who, we can know someone, have a relationship with them or know about them. And so, or we can know what, right? We can identify objects, terms, and so on. And so those are the general broad categories for knowledges we can have. When I asked some other students last semester about how they know things, some of the other responses we got kind of went to more this sort of challenging the idea of knowledge. How can we really actually know anything? We can only know through testing, investigating, and inference, and we know what we believe to be true. And here the student is saying, acknowledging that we should, reach out and be exposed to other ideas, and make sure that the knowledge we have, or that we think we have, is indeed justified. And so separating research from everyday ways of knowing, knowledge we have often isn't tested or questioned. And so things that we know to be true, like ketchup goes on French fries, like very run-of-the-mill statement that nobody's really going to find too offensive. Sorry for the ketchup haters. But we also have things like personal experience. And so it took me a while to figure out not to touch a hot stove, or right? Isaac Newton was sitting under the tree and an apple hit him. He's like, oh, hey, there's this thing, gravity, boom, we're done. We also often use intuition. So you'll hear arguments, even coming from politicians, talking about how something just makes sense. It's simply sensible. And so intuition, something is usually a red flag because it often results in mistaken perception and bad judgments. And so, we also have authority. We might listen to the head of the CDC regarding health risks. We might, look to a local authority, or perhaps a person of authority in your family for advice or for information. And then we also have tradition, custom, and faith. And so Berger makes the point that sometimes that works out really well, and it's, proven to be justifiably good. Chicken soup actually does contain healing chemicals that help with your cold. Cuddling and goo-gooing at babies has benefits, both the adult and the baby. You get some happy hormones released. From the Berger chapter that he gives, and I wanted to use it to kind of round out, move concepts beyond trees and bushes, but thinking about kind of the way that words carry particular meanings, and they carry a range of meanings. And so this is from a study he cites looking at youth culture in Japan, in post-war Japan. And so the researcher was talking about how these terms have come to be used, dry and wet, and not just to refer to literally being dry or wet, but rather, the young people were talked about as dry, and then they had all these associated characteristics, right? And that meant that they were direct as opposed to being polite, or pragmatic and not, dedicated to romantic causes. They liked United States things, Hemingway and Cowboys and Gunmen, rather than traditional Japanese, forms, haiku and samurai. And so in this, dry and wet carried a conceptual notion that actually had meaning far beyond how we would understand it. But that's one of the really kind of interesting and fun things about research, and the reasons why concepts and context are so important, because without kind of an insider's knowledge of how the Japanese youth were using these terms, we would have very little idea how, it would make no sense what dry and wet mean. And so from moving beyond like that, this is how these concepts are being talked about and how they're being applied, into then exploring the historical context of what these shifts reflect, that's happened in Japanese society since World War II. That leads to a really interesting study that tells us a lot about the world that we didn't know before. And that's all for right now. Click back on titanium for the next lesson.